There is a moment in every family history where the truth becomes too dark to whisper and too dangerous to forget. And when you follow the trail of the Boleyns long enough, you reach a place where the candles tremble, the walls listen, and every beautiful story about a betrayed queen dissolves into a far more chilling truth. The Boleyn family did not fall because of lust, or ambition, or witchcraft, or adultery, but because a father learned to treat his children as currency and a king learned to destroy anyone who made him feel trapped. The most horrifying truth buried beneath 5 centuries of rumor is not the incest accusation, not the 5 executed men, not even the 2 siblings walking together toward the axe. The real horror is that all of it was engineered, calculated, and executed with perfect precision by a system that demanded blood and by the people who were willing to spill it. When you peel away the court gossip, when you brush aside the staged testimonies, when you silence the whispers in the dark corridors of the Tudor palace, you begin to see the bigger story, one so enormous and so cruel that part 1 needs to show you the entire machine before the next 9 parts take you inside each gear. The Boleyn family began their rise in the late 15th century, sometime around the birth of Thomas Boleyn in the year 1477, a man who did not inherit power, but hunted it with the hunger of a wolf raised outside the firelight. He spoke French, Latin, Italian, and survival. He married Elizabeth Howard, not for love but as a ladder rung. And when Mary, Anne, and George were born at the turn of the 16th century, he did not see children. He saw investments, leverage, stepping stones, potential sacrifices, and that is where our nightmare begins. Because the man who eventually watched 2 of his children die on a scaffold was also the one who pushed them into the king's path in the first place. Mary Boleyn, the eldest surviving daughter, was sent to France around the age of 13 or 14, not to be refined, but to be sharpened. And by the time she returned to England, in the year 1519, she had been polished into exactly the sort of courtly ornament a king might want to take apart. Henry VIII noticed her almost immediately. Their affair hidden, whispered about, rewarded richly was less a romance and more a business investment from which everyone profited, except Mary herself. She bore children, Catherine and Henry, sometime around the years 1524 and 1526. Children whispered for centuries to possibly be the king's. But Mary was disposable. She faded. She married again. She slipped into obscurity, and that obscurity saved her life. Anne Boleyn learned from watching her sister's destruction like a child, learning the rules of a monster's game: never be the mistress, to be the wife. And when Henry VIII turned his attention from Mary to Anne around the mid-1520s, Anne did something no one in England expected. She said no. She refused to be used, refused to be touched, to refuse to be another Boleyn daughter traded for influence. The refusal did not push Henry away. It ignited him. Years later, he would tear England away from Rome to possess her. But part 1 needs you to see something the history books politely sidestep. Anne's refusal was not a moral stand. It was survival. She knew what happened to mistresses. She had lived under the same roof where her sister wept. The years between 1527 and 1533 were a slow-burning war of obsession, theology, and political arson. Henry demanded a divorce from Catherine of Aragon. The Pope refused. Cardinal Wolsey fell. Thomas Cromwell rose. And Thomas Boleyn collected titles Viscount Rochford in year 1525, Earl of Wiltshire in year 1529, like a man preparing his house for a storm he knew he might not survive. Anne finally allowed Henry into her bed, in late 1532, became pregnant, and in the month of June of 1533, she was crowned Queen of England in a ceremony that promised the birth of a prince who would justify every sin committed along the way. But the child born that September was a girl, Elizabeth, a future queen, but in that moment, merely a disappointment wrapped in velvet. From that moment, the sand under Anne's feet began to slide. She miscarried in year 1534. She miscarried again on the day Catherine of Aragon was buried in year 1536. A male fetus that broke the king's last thread of patience. Henry spoke coldly of a curse, of God refusing him sons through her. Cromwell, once her ally, saw the shift, and like all men who love survival more than loyalty, he began building the charges that would kill her. Adultery, high treason, witchcraft whispered behind closed doors, and the most explosive weapon of all, incest. With her brother George, Part 1 cannot retell every twist in detail. Those belong to the 9 parts ahead, but it must show you the shape of the blade before it falls. Cromwell gathered witnesses, tortured a musician into confessing, twisted flirtations into betrayals, invented dates, and filled the gaps with the kind of filth that silences defenders. The trials in mid-May of 1536 were pre-written tragedies disguised as justice. George was sentenced first. Then Anne, beheading by sword for her. Beheading for him after the king reluctantly removed a more torturous penalty. And on the 17th day of May, George died on Tower Hill. On the 19th day of May, Anne knelt within the tower and lost her head in a single clean stroke. 11 days later, Henry married Jane Seymour. Thomas Boleyn lived, quietly, comfortably, covertly. The system he fed devoured his children, and he simply stepped back and allowed it. But Mary Boleyn, the forgotten one, the failure, the discarded mistress, survived. Her children thrived. And Anne's daughter, Elizabeth, the child born under thunderous expectation, rose decades later to rule England for 45 years, becoming the greatest monarch her father ever produced. This entire series, beginning with Part 1, is not the story of a queen who committed adultery. It is the story of a family engineered for sacrifice, a father who treated his children like currency, a king who killed his way out of discomfort, and a system that turned ambition into blood. It begins quietly, almost too quietly, the way a storm sometimes begins with a shift in the air rather than a crack of thunder. And when you follow Anne Boleyn back into the private chambers where her story truly unfolded, you realize that the most terrifying things in her life did not come from swords or scaffolds or shouting crowds, but from the slow erosion of certainty that ate at her long before the charges, long before the tower. Long before the cold voice of a king, deciding he no longer wanted the woman he once destroyed a kingdom to possess. In those early months as queen, when the gold threads of her coronation gown were still uncreased and the scent of lilies still clung to the corners of her new apartments, Anne lived with a kind of suspended breath, knowing that every hour she carried Henry's heir inside her. She was safe, praised, untouchable, and knowing that every hour after her daughter's birth, she was living on borrowed time, because a queen without a son was a queen with a crack in her crown. And cracks have a way of widening, no matter how tightly you press your hands against them. She tried to mask the fear with brightness, with laughter, with the quick, sharp wit that once made Henry forget the weight of his throne. But the court felt the tremor beneath her smile. You can hear it when you read through the letters she never answered. Sense it in the way her footsteps changed, from confident echoes across stone to softer, more cautious movements, as if she feared the floors themselves were listening. The Tudor court had always been a hunting ground where people waited for weakness, the way wolves wait for a stumble. But now Anne was the wounded creature in the center, and she could taste it. That metallic flavor of being watched by those who once bowed too deeply. Even the tapestries seemed to shift around her, the eyes woven into their threads, appearing to follow her down corridors where she once walked like a woman born to rule. And yet, in the midst of all that quiet terror, she still tried to be hopeful, still tried to believe the rhythm of life would correct itself, still tried to imagine that God, having allowed her to survive 1,000 storms already, would not abandon her now. She prayed in the early hours before dawn, whispering into candlelight so soft that even the flame barely trembled. And sometimes she held her daughter in the dimness of her chambers and pressed her cheek to the child's hair, as if borrowing strength from a tiny heartbeat. Elizabeth, not yet 2 years old, looked up at her with that alert, almost unsettling focus that newborns sometimes have, as if seeing something far beyond the room. And in those moments, Anne allowed herself a fragile, aching hope that perhaps the child in her arms would change destiny in ways no astrologer could predict. But hope can be a cruel companion when the world is sharpening its knives behind your back. Henry's shifting affection did not break in a sudden moment. It dissolved like frost on warm stone. At first he grew distracted, talking more softly about state matters and less softly about Jane Seymour, the quiet, pale woman who moved with the diffident gentleness Anne had once pretended to admire and now found herself wanting to flee from. Henry smiled differently around Jane, the way a man smiles when he feels admired rather than challenged. And Anne could see that smile from across a crowded room even when he tried to hide it. If she spoke too fiercely about politics, Henry's jaw tightened. If she laughed too boldly, he turned away. If she argued, he froze like a man remembering everything he once adored, and now finding it suddenly unbearable. She began choosing her words carefully, counting her breaths, measuring her tone, the way one might speak to a sleeping animal you fear will wake hungry. But the worst moments were the nights when Henry did not come to her chambers, leaving her awake beside a cooling hearth. Listening to the sounds of distant footsteps in corridors she could no longer control. She would sit at her dressing table staring into the polished metal mirror, tracing the line of her own face with her fingertips, studying the dark eyes that once captivated a king, and wondering whether power had aged her or whether fear had carved fine cracks around her mouth. The mirror reflected not a queen but a woman caught between past triumph and future ruin. And occasionally she would look away quickly, as if trying to outrun her own reflection. You must understand that Anne was not simply proud or ruthless or sharp-tongued, as the stories like to say. She was exhausted by years of fighting for her position, by the endless negotiations, by the pressure to embody hope, every hour of every day, by the knowledge that everything rested on her womb and nothing rested on her will. This exhaustion seeped into her bones, made her more volatile, more vulnerable, more desperate to hold on to a man who had already begun letting go. She tried to charm him, tried to soothe his temper, tried to call back the affection that once flared between them like wildfire. But Henry had begun to crave ease rather than excitement, obedience rather than spark. And Anne, tragically, beautifully, painfully, was made of fire. In the quiet moments after her second miscarriage, when the palace fell into the uneasy stillness that follows tragedy, Anne felt something inside her unravel. She clutched her stomach with trembling hands. Trying to bargain with a god she feared, was already looking away. The corridors felt colder. The servants bowed with a shade too much sympathy. Every whisper behind her sounded like prophecy. She reached for Henry, tried to explain, tried to tell him grief had shaken her body. Not fate, but his eyes were already drifting to another future, another hope. Another woman who promised simplicity over intensity. Anne saw it. She felt it. And in that recognition, something inside her hardened into a terror that kept her awake for weeks. From there, the unraveling quickened. Men who once swore loyalty now stepped back. Cromwell's face cooled into something unreadable. Even her uncle, the Duke of Norfolk, spoke to her with a distance that chilled her blood. And Anne, sensing danger the way animals sense earthquakes before they crack the earth open, began watching the court with wide, dense eyes, waiting for the first tremor to break the floor beneath her. She clung to Elizabeth. She clung to prayer. She clung to the fading warmth of Henry's hand. But each of these became harder to reach as the days curled into shadows at her feet. In those final months before her arrest, the palace felt less like a home and more like a labyrinth of corridors, twisting into suspicion, doors opening into doubt, faces turning away at exactly the moment she needed them to meet her gaze. And every night when she lay down beside a husband who touched her less and listened to her even less, she could feel the silence gathering around her bed like mist rising from cold water. One night she murmured to her ladies that she felt as if the air itself were thinning, that sometimes when she tried to breathe, her lungs filled with dread instead of air. And although they comforted her, their hands gently smoothing her hair, the terror in her chest only grew heavier. This is the beginning of her fall. Not the arrests, not the trial, not the tower, but these nights, these long, slow nights when she felt the walls tightening and the world shifting under her feet. Darkness does not always arrive with screams. Sometimes it sits beside you quietly, waiting for the moment your hope flickers. And Anne, in those dim corridors and sleepless rooms, could feel her hope thinning thread by fragile thread, long before anyone spoke her name in accusation. There is a moment near the end of a woman's strength when she stops running from her fear and begins listening to it. And for Anne Boleyn, that moment arrived, not with a scream or a messenger bursting through her doors, but with a quiet evening when the palace lamps burned low and the scent of rushes on the floor rose up in warm, earthy waves. She had dismissed her ladies for the night and found herself alone with the stillness that had begun to feel like a living creature, something that circled her slowly each evening, as if studying the cracks that were growing in her defenses. She sat near the window, the glass cold beneath her fingertips, and listened to the distant hum of the court below, a sound that once reminded her of possibility, but now carried the sharpness of judgment. For years she had walked through these halls like a flame, but on that night she felt the uncomfortable truth settling across her shoulders. The great machinery of power was turning, and she no longer knew which wheel she stood beneath. In those days before the fall, small things became prophetic. The way a servant paused before answering her, the way a noblewoman curtsied just a little too slowly, the way even the king's falconers bowed with eyes that refused to meet hers. Anne had always lived in a world where every gesture mattered, but now the tiniest movements glowed with hidden meaning, and she felt herself constantly deciphering shadows. Sometimes she would sit very still, listening, trying to catch the whispers that darted just out of reach. Once, as she walked toward the chapel, she heard two gentlemen abruptly silence themselves at the sound of her footsteps, and the look they exchanged afterward wrapped itself around her heart like a tightening vine. She had been feared once, admired once, the center of the court's attention, but now she was something else entirely, something unstable, something risky, something people avoided touching lest they be pulled into her fate. Her attempts to steady her place became more frantic, though she tried to hide it beneath courtly grace. She pressed herself into her duties with a kind of desperate elegance, hosting dinners with the sweetness of a woman, determined to save what was slipping from her grasp. She laughed in the right moments, spoke with perfect courtesy, and yet every word was measured, every gesture careful, as if she were dancing on a frozen river listening for the first crack beneath her feet. Henry's absences grew longer, his gazette colder. Then came the evening when he visited her chambers without warning. His expression unreadable, his tone clipped with a kind of firmness that chilled her more than any outburst ever could. He spoke little, offered no explanations, and when he left she pressed her palms into the mattress and remained sitting there, listening to the slow echo of his footsteps fade into the corridor until it felt like the palace itself was swallowing him from her. There were nights she wandered her chambers unable to sleep, touching the carved details on the wooden panels as if they might answer her, pausing sometimes to rest her forehead against the cool stone, wishing she could step beyond her own skin and see the world from outside this tightening circle. She tried to speak to God in the hours before dawn, but even prayer felt muted, as if her words were being absorbed by the walls rather than sent upward. Her daughter's small bed sat near her larger one, a quiet reminder of the single success she could not afford to lose. And occasionally Anne would kneel beside it and watch Elizabeth breathe, steady and calm, untouched by the hurricane gathering on the other side of the palace gates. In those moments, she allowed herself to imagine a future where her daughter grew into a woman of sharp intelligence and unbreakable will. But the vision collapsed quickly, each time she remembered there might be no one left to guide such a future into shape. The court around her tightened its circles, and the people who once orbited her with admiration now drifted towards safer stars. When she entered a room, conversations paused in a way that felt almost ritualistic, as if her presence dimmed the air. At times she sensed Jane Seymour watching her from a distance, hands neatly folded, face calm, and the quietness of that woman began to feel more threatening than the sharpest insult. Jane did not need to say anything. Her silence was the kind that invited kings to rest in it. Anne saw the way Henry softened around Jane, the way he seemed relieved by the quiet refuge she embodied. It was a painful thing for Anne to witness, that particular kind of abandonment, where the man who once tore down an entire world for you now craved the comfort of someone who would never challenge him at all. Yet it was not Jane or Henry who kept Anne awake at night. It was Cromwell, the man who had once worked beside her, who had helped reshape England under the vast shadow of her influence, now carried an expression she recognized from her earliest days at court. The expression of a man who has already weighed the cost of your fall and found it acceptable. He began to avoid her gaze, or else hold it too long with a courteousness too perfect to be anything but a warning. In council meetings he spoke of matters she was excluded from, and when she attempted to challenge his decisions, he deflected her with the smooth confidence of someone who understood exactly how much time she had left. Then came the whispers. Strange, curling things that seemed to creep beneath doorframes before reaching her. Whispers that did not accuse her directly, but suggested something was shifting beneath the surface. Something dangerous. Something being prepared quietly in the rooms where men built political storms. She heard her name linked with words like unrest and impatience and questions about the succession. And though nothing yet pointed toward accusations, Anne felt the shift deep in her bones. She sensed the space narrowing around her, felt the old alliances thinning like threads, rubbed too often between anxious fingers. One evening she confronted Cromwell in a corridor, lined with tapestries that depicted battles greater men had fought. Their exchange was brief, but every word carried the weight of a duel, fought silently beneath the eyes of stitched warriors. Anne spoke with the authority of a queen, yet her voice trembled with urgency. And Cromwell replied with that calm politeness that was more terrifying than anger. He did not threaten her, did not hint at charges, did not raise his tone. He simply said the king wished for stability and England needed peace. And something in his calmness hollowed her like a sudden illness. She knew then that Cromwell had already set the wheels spinning, and she understood that once the machinery began, no one, not even Henry, could stop it without admitting their own mistake. Days folded into one another with the soft dread of a candle burning too close to its base. Anne found herself lingering near windows, watching the horizon, as if waiting for a sign she could no longer describe. Her pulse quickened at the sound of boots in the corridor, and every time Henry's steps grew near, she felt her heart race with the hope that he might reassure her, only to collapse under the weight of disappointment when he offered nothing but polite indifference. Even the air in her chambers felt heavier, carrying the scent of damp wool and aging stone, and as she lay awake beside the silent figure of her husband, she realized she was already living in a kind of half-exile, within walls she once commanded. The moment of arrest had not yet arrived, but Anne could feel it approaching with the certainty of a tide pulling back before a violent wave. It was there in the dreams that woke her with a gasp, in the tremor of her fingertips when a servant dropped a tray, in the way her ladies whispered too carefully when they thought she was not listening. She tasted her own fear in every breath, a metallic note that never quite faded, and though she kept her chin raised during the day, moving with the poise expected of a queen, the nights chipped away at her resolve, leaving her frayed and fragile by dawn. And somewhere deep inside her, beneath the layers of pride, panic, and exhaustion, a quiet truth began forming like frost across a window. She was no longer fighting for power or position or the future she once imagined. She was fighting to survive the next day, the next hour, the next breath, hoping the walls would not close in, before she found some way, any way, to remind the king that the woman he now avoided had once been the center of his universe. It happened, as these things often do, on a day that carried no warning, a day whose sunlight seemed almost ordinary, a day where the palace corridors held the same quiet rustle of servants and the muted clatter of distant preparations. And yet Anne felt the strange pressure in the air as she dressed, as though the world itself had drawn in a breath and was holding it against her skin. Anne had always lived in a world where every gesture mattered, but now the tiniest movements glowed with hidden meaning, and she felt herself constantly deciphering shadows. Sometimes she would sit very still, listening, trying to catch the whispers that darted just out of reach. Once, as she walked toward the chapel, she heard two gentlemen abruptly silence themselves at the sound of her footsteps, and the look they exchanged afterward wrapped itself around her heart like a tightening vine. Even the air in her chambers felt heavier, carrying the scent of damp wool and aging stone, and as she lay awake beside the silent figure of her husband, she realized she was already living in a kind of half-exile, within walls she once commanded. The moment of arrest had not yet arrived, but Anne could feel it approaching with the certainty of a tide pulling back before a violent wave. And on this particular morning she felt the chill stronger than ever, sensed the way her ladies avoided her gaze just a moment too long, sensed the stiffness in the bow of a guard stationed outside her door, sensed the distant murmurs of men whose voices she could not yet distinguish, but whose purpose she intuitively understood was not innocent. What made the dread more unbearable was the absence of any clear accusation. Nothing had been said, nothing formally announced, nothing signed or sealed, yet the silent machinery of danger moved around her with terrible certainty. She even tried to shake it off as superstition, telling herself that she had endured worse moments, that the court's mood shifted on whims, that her mind was playing cruel tricks. But the truth lingered stubbornly beneath every thought. Something was happening behind doors she no longer had permission to open. She stood before her mirror, adjusting the sleeves of her gown, and noticed her hands trembling slightly. Not enough for her ladies to remark upon, but enough for her to understand that fear had finally seeped through the last fragile wall of denial she had been building around herself. She took another breath, one meant to steady her heart. But the air felt thick, damp, as though it belonged to a room underground rather than a queen's chambers. When their eyes briefly met hers, Cromwell's expression did not flicker with guilt or apology. It remained steady, almost serene, and that serenity pierced her with more fear than any open threat could have. As she prepared to join the court that afternoon, one of her ladies accidentally dropped a ring as she fastened Anne's sleeve, and the sharp, metallic clink against the floor made Anne's heart leap as though it were the sound of a sword drawn behind her. She paused, turning slowly, and her lady's murmured apology trembled with an emotion that had no place in an ordinary mistake. Anne touched the ring gently, picking it up, not for its value, but because she needed something solid to anchor her shaking breath. She closed her palm around it as if closing her hand around the last piece of steady ground she possessed. The court itself felt strangely hollow, as though people had been strategically arranged to appear present while their minds were somewhere far away, each calculating how close they should stand to a falling queen. Conversations dipped when she approached. Smiles tightened at the corners. Men bowed, but too quickly rose, and she sensed the way their eyes slid past her, rather than toward her. Even the chandeliers overhead flickered as though reacting to a tension so heavy it bent the air beneath it. Henry was there, seated beside the throne, speaking to a cluster of advisors with the casual authority of a man who had already made up his mind about something and saw no need to explain it to anyone beyond the circle of his choosing. When he noticed Anne approaching, he did not rise, did not extend a hand, did not even soften his features. Instead, he gave her a measured, distant glance, the kind that strips the entire world of color, and then turned back to his conversation, as if she were nothing more than an unexpected draft of wind passing through the hall. Her chest tightened, and she felt heat build behind her eyes, though she willed it back with every ounce of discipline she possessed. Queens did not cry in front of the court. Queens did not bargain with their own hearts. Queens did not let their terror be tasted by those waiting to feast on it. She lifted her chin, reminding herself of who she had been when Henry chased her like a man drowning in his own longing. She remembered the letters he had written, the vows he had sworn, the world he had torn down brick by brick just to reach her. And yet, standing there beneath his indifferent gaze, she felt like a relic from a world that had already been swept away. Late that evening, after the council had dispersed and the palace corridors had emptied into the soft hush of night, Anne walked alone through a passageway lit by oil lamps, whose flames wavered as though troubled by a draught. The stones beneath her feet were cold, and she paused halfway down the hall, closing her eyes as a strange heaviness washed over her. A heaviness so dense, she had to place one hand on the wall to steady herself. The silence around her seemed to tilt. The shadows stretched longer, and in that moment she felt as though the palace itself had turned its back on her, as though the walls she once commanded had become part of a labyrinth building itself to swallow her whole. She turned a corner and nearly collided with Sir Henry Norris, one of the king's closest attendants, a man she had once spoken to freely, even warmly. Tonight, however, his face carried a pallor she had never seen before. His bow was too deep, his voice too soft, and when she asked whether he was unwell, he hesitated, his gaze lowering as though he feared being seen speaking to her. That hesitation carved a hollow place inside her, a place she could already sense would soon become a grave for every comfort she once believed in. And then, in the early hours of the next morning, before the sky had fully shaken off the darkness, the sound came footsteps, purposeful and heavy, accompanied by the low murmur of men, speaking with the clipped tone of those following orders too serious to question. The noise grew louder, travelling down the corridor toward her chambers. Anna sat upright in her bed, pulse hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird, desperate to break free. And for a moment she whispered to herself that perhaps it was nothing. Perhaps it was some routine matter unrelated to her. But deep within her, she felt the world shift. I felt fate turning like a great door, opening onto a room she had never wished to enter. The knock at her outer chamber door was firm, almost ceremonial. Her ladies startled awake. Candles were lit in a rush of trembling hands. Ernesto, a coldness snaking up her spine as the door creaked open, and the lieutenant of the tower stepped inside. His expression grave, his posture rigid, with the kind of duty that brooked no argument. And in the breath between his bow and his first word, Anne understood, truly understood, that the waiting was over. The whispers finished. The illusions shattered. She was no longer a queen fighting shadows. She was a prisoner. The moment her arrest became real did not arrive with shouting or violence, but with a quiet nod from the lieutenant of the tower. A nod that carried centuries of dread in its stillness. A nod that made Anne feel as though the air had turned to stone around her. She stood barefoot on the cold floor, the hem of her nightgown brushing her ankles. And for a heartbeat she felt time itself hesitate, as if the world were deciding whether to let her fall or pull her back. But when the lieutenant spoke, softly, respectfully, his voice steady with the weight of duty, she knew the world had already chosen. His words were formal, telling her she was to accompany him for questioning by royal order. But everything in his eyes told her what the words did. Not there would be no returning to this room. No reclaiming these walls. No waking from this nightmare into the life she once knew so well. Her ladies trembled as they wrapped a cloak around her shoulders, their hands fluttering like frightened birds, trying to hide their tears with shallow breaths. The corridor outside her chamber felt longer than ever before. The torches, casting distorted shadows along the walls that stretched ahead of her like a path into another realm. As she stepped into the hallway, the palace exhaled a cold draft that brushed her face, and Anne felt something inside her body tighten, as if her own heart understood that nothing familiar would ever greet her again. The walk across the courtyard was unbearably slow. Guards flanked her with the kind of stiff respect given to people already half in the grave. The shadows stretched longer, and in that moment she felt as though the palace itself had turned its back on her, as though the walls she once commanded had become part of a labyrinth building itself to swallow her whole. She turned a corner and nearly collided with Sir Henry Norris, one of the king's closest attendants, a man she had once spoken to freely, even warmly. Tonight, however, his face carried a pallor she had never seen before. For a moment she wondered whether Henry was awake, somewhere behind a shuttered window, perhaps watching her through the slit in a curtain, or whether he slept peacefully, the decision already tucked away in some untroubled corner of his mind. They placed her in a small barge to cross the Thames, and as the water lapped against the wooden sides, she sat utterly still, her hands clasped so tightly, her knuckles whitened. The river mist curled around her, creeping into her cloak, turning her breath into pale, trembling wisps that drifted across the boat and disappeared into the morning light. She had passed this river before as a queen, greeted by cheering crowds and banners, carried by pomp and triumph toward her coronation. Now the silence felt so complete that she could hear the uneven beating of her own heart. When the Tower of London rose before her out of the fog, massive, unscient, implacable, Anne felt the kind of dread that clings to the bones rather than the flesh. The lieutenant guided her up the stone steps with solemn courtesy, and when the heavy wooden door of the tower swung open, she felt the cold breath of the fortress sweep over her like a shroud. Inside, the walls absorbed sound so completely that even her footsteps seemed muted. They did not take her to a dungeon, for she was still a queen in title, but the rooms they led her to were bare, their silence sharp enough to cut, Even the air felt different here, dense, unmoving, filled with the ghosts of those who had walked this same path, expecting mercy that never came. When the door of her chamber closed behind her, the finality of the sound struck her deeper than any accusation could have. She stood in the center of the room for a long moment, staring at the narrow window that allowed only a sliver of pale light to fall across the floor. It was a room she had occupied 3 years earlier, on the eve of her coronation, filled with music and celebration. A room that hummed with expectation and joy. Now the same walls felt unfamiliar, stripped, hostile, holding a memory she could no longer recognize. She lowered herself onto the bench by the wall, the wood cold, and clasped her hands in her lap, trying to steady the tremor that had begun at the base of her spine. Her ladies-in-waiting entered slowly, their steps hesitant. Some were pale, avoiding her eyes. Others fought back tears. One looked as though she might faint. They tried to comfort her, murmuring assurances that everything would be cleared, that the king only sought truth, that Cromwell could not possibly mean harm. Anne listened, but their words drifted through her like smoke, insubstantial, gone before they could anchor themselves to hope. She thanked them softly, each syllable spoken with a dignity she clung to like the last thread of a fraying tapestry. But inside she felt herself unraveling, pulled apart by the reality of a world that had turned its back on her. Minutes stretched into hours with the kind of slowness that makes time feel like a living beast. Crouched beside her, watching her unravel. Every distant sound, the clank of armor, the murmur of guards, the echo of footsteps in the tower stairwell carried its own weight of terror. She expected, at any moment, that the door would burst open with accusations sharp enough to slice through her composure. But instead there was only silence. Long stretches of silence that pressed down on her chest until she could hardly breathe. Her thoughts drifted to Elizabeth, to the soft, downy curls she had brushed before bed, to the way the child's small fingers curled around hers, to the bright gaze that seemed too wise for her tender age. The thought of her daughter growing up motherless clawed at Anne's heart with a pain so fierce she pressed a hand to her chest as if she could physically hold it inside. She whispered Elizabeth's name into the stillness, a fragile sound that seemed to tremble in the air before dissolving. She wondered whether Henry would protect the child, or whether Elizabeth, too, would be pushed aside, declared illegitimate, erased from a future that might have been hers. As the hours passed, her mind dipped into memories with the sharpness of a blade, memories of Henry writing her poems, of secret meetings, of furtive glances, of the way his hand trembled, the first night he confessed he would change the world for her. She remembered the warmth of his laugh, the intensity of his faith in their future, all the moments when he looked at her as though she were the only reason the crown rested on his head. She wondered now whether those memories had been real or merely reflections of a man who desired something new, fleeting, unattainably bright, until the brightness became inconvenient. Her first interrogation arrived in the late afternoon, and though the men spoke politely, their politeness was a blade disguised as courtesy. They asked questions structured like traps, questions designed not to uncover truth, but to confirm a narrative already written. Words like impropriety and suspicion and treason floated through the air, heavy, poisonous, clinging to her like smoke. She answered calmly, her voice tight, but unwavering, denying every accusation with the clarity of a woman who knows her truth is meaningless against a verdict already chosen. When they left, Anne sank onto her narrow bed, her breath ragged, her composure cracked. She pressed her fingers into the mattress, seeking some texture that might ground her. But everything felt unreal, as though she were living inside a dream. constructed by someone else. Evening crept through the narrow window, turning the room to dusk, and the shadows lengthened until they reached her feet like dark hands stretching across the floor. Only then did the full weight of her captivity settle upon her, the knowledge that the people deciding her fate were not listening to her words, that the king she had loved would not save her, that the life she once commanded had slipped through her fingers like sand, carried away on a bitter wind. And in the deepening quiet, she understood a truth she had never dared to speak aloud. The tower was not simply a prison, it was a foretelling. Night inside the tower does not fall the way night falls elsewhere. It seeps in slowly, gathering first in the corners like damp shadows clinging to the stone, then thickening in the air until even the candles struggle to breathe. Anne felt it settling around her as she lay on the thin mattress, the coarse linen brushing her cheek, the cold pressing through the blankets no matter how tightly she wrapped them around her body. Every sound became magnified in that unnatural silence, the faint scrape of a guard's boot, the creak of old timbers shifting overhead, the distant drip of water finding its way through ancient stone, and with each sound came the same terrible realization she was listening for footsteps, not because she expected rescue, but because she feared the accusations that would soon arrive under the cloak of procedure. She could not sleep, though exhaustion clung to her limbs. Her mind kept drifting back to the interrogation earlier in the day. The way the men had spoken to her with voices softened into a deceptive tenderness, as though they were trying to coax a confession from a frightened child rather than question a queen. They used phrases that sounded harmless on the surface, but carried venom beneath them. Phrases like, "We simply need clarification," or "Surely you did not intend to give the impression that," or "Certain statements have been made which require your response." Each sentence felt like a rope woven from words, slowly coiling tighter around her wrists. She remembered the moment when one of them, a man she had seen many times at court, leaned forward with a look that almost resembled pity. He asked her about Mark Smeaton with an unsettling precision, weaving moments so ordinary she had barely remembered them into threads of insinuation. Had he played for her too often? Had he spoken to her in private? Had she given him tokens? Had she smiled at him in a way others might misinterpret? And Anne realized then, with a sinking coldness, that they were not searching for truth. They were extracting pieces, fragments, histories, arranging them into a shape she did not recognize, but they had already decided belonged to her. When the questioning ended and the door closed behind them, she had felt as though something invisible had been carved out of her. As a part of her spirit, she needed to stand tall but no longer possessed. She tried to steady herself, tried to remember the confidence that once allowed her to walk through court like a force of nature. But here in the tower, that past version of herself felt impossibly distant. A woman whose fire had illuminated rooms and commanded kings, but now flickered faintly like the last ember of a dying flame. Before dawn, her ladies interred quietly, their faces drawn with fear and sleeplessness. They brought her water, combed her hair with trembling fingers, and tried to offer the small comforts of routine. But Anne could see the truth in their eyes. They had heard whispers in the corridors during the night, whispers that slithered beneath doors, whispers naming men she knew well, men who had once laughed beside her at banquets, men she had trusted: Francis Weston, Henry Norris, William Brereton, Mark Smeaton. The names felt like stones dropping into her stomach one by one. Her ladies were too afraid to say what they had heard outright. But fragments slipped through, Smeaton taken in the night, Norris questioned at length, Weston pale and silent as he was escorted across the courtyard. And then, almost too soft to hear, one of the women whispered the name that made Anne's body go rigid. George? Her brother? The room tilted, the air thinned, For a moment, the world dissolved into a distant ringing, like a bell struck deep underwater. She clutched the edge of the table to steady herself. Her breath lodged painfully in her throat. She asked them to repeat it, hoping she had misheard. But the look in their eyes was answer enough. George had been taken to the tower, questioned, accused. Her brother, the person who understood her better than anyone alive, the person whose mind ran parallel to hers in sharpness and wit, the person who shared her triumphs, her jokes, her fears taken. And with that single name, the terror she had endured, until now transformed into something deeper and more corrosive. Something that felt like betrayal carved with surgical precision. She remembered the way George had often urged her to be careful around Cromwell, how he had warned her that the man smiled with his teeth but calculated with his eyes. She remembered how George stood beside her in council chambers, how he argued for her, protected her, how he once told her quietly during a feast that he had no future separate from hers because their fates were woven together too tightly. And now, the world was using that closeness as a weapon. The door opened again just after sunrise, and for one heart-stopping moment she feared it was another round of accusations. Instead, it was the lieutenant bringing her a meal she could not eat. His gaze lingered on her, with a sorrow she could not decipher. She asked him, voice trembling, whether he had heard anything of her brother, but he only bowed his head slightly, a gesture that told her far more than words could. He could not speak of George because to speak of him was to acknowledge that something irreversible had begun. As the day crept forward in slow, suffocating increments, Anne felt the tower closing in around her like a living creature. The walls seemed to lean inward, the air thickening as though heavy with unspoken accusations. She tried to pray, tried to settle her thoughts, but her mind kept drifting to the men whose names had now become part of her fate. She pictured Norris with his gentle loyalty, Weston with his easy charm, Brereton with his quiet devotion to the king's service. She remembered harmless conversations, courtly dances, the kind of light-hearted flirtation expected of any queen carrying the weight of a court's expectations. None of it was improper. All of it could be twisted. By midday, the interrogators returned, their faces composed in the same courtly calm that made Anne want to scream. They did not accuse her directly at first. Instead, they circled her like wolves waiting for a stumble. Then, with a softness that made the words even more brutal, they began pressing about George. Had she spoken to him about the king's inability to father sons? Had she confided in him matters unsuitable for a queen to discuss with any man? Had they shared moments too private, too affectionate, too familiar? The accusation was taking shape before her eyes. Methodical, vile, dressed in the language of procedure but pulsing with poison. Anne's breath came faster, her voice sharpening with each denial. But they pressed forward with the precision of surgeons carving out the story they wanted. And the more she defended her innocence, the more her desperation became fuel for their suspicions. When they left again, Anne sank to the floor, pressing her palms against the cold stone as though trying to feel the world beneath her feet, to remind herself that she was still here, still alive, still herself. But even the stone felt indifferent, offering no comfort. As darkness pooled once more around the window in her chamber, and the tower whispered with the movements of distant guards, Anne realized with a clarity both devastating and illuminating that truth no longer mattered. The accusations were no longer seeds. They were growing into the monstrous shape that would swallow her. And as she sat alone in the deepening night, her body trembling, her breath shallow, she understood the terrible design behind it to destroy her completely. They would not begin by killing her. They would begin by killing her hope. By the time the next morning forced its pale light through the narrow sliver of window in Anne's chamber, the tower no longer felt like a place that was holding her. It felt like a place that was studying her, memorizing her breath, her heartbeat, her trembling hands, as though preparing itself for the moment it would crush what remained of her dignity. She rose from the bed without speaking, her body aching from the stone-cold night, her mind drifting painfully between fragments of prayer and memories of her brother's laughter. Her ladies watched her with wide, frightened eyes, sensing that the invisible threads circling her had tightened again overnight. Pulling her toward a fate none of them had the strength to name aloud. The interrogators returned not long after sunrise. Their footsteps echoed down the corridor in a steady rhythm that sounded almost ceremonial, the kind of slow, deliberate march that precedes a verdict rather than a question. When the door opened, their expressions had changed. Gone were the polite masks, replaced now with a colder resolve. The look of men who believed the shape of truth mattered less than the shape of the story they had been ordered to finalize. Anne felt her breath catch in her throat as they bowed and asked permission to begin, the gesture so steeped in courtesy that it became its own cruelty. They began with the names again: Norris, Weston, Braytone. Smeaton spoken with the hollow detachment of men reciting a list of objects rather than lives. This time, they did not ask whether she had spoken to them, laughed with them, danced with them. They asked instead why she had allowed them such familiarity, why she had permitted them to linger near her in the gardens, why she had ever smiled at them in ways that could be interpreted as invitation. Each question was designed not to uncover truth, but to force her into silence. Because innocence had become irrelevant. They were no longer examining actions, they were examining interpretations. And interpretations could be shaped into anything they wished. Anne answered each question with as much composure as she could summon. But the exhaustion in her voice grew heavier with every denial. The interrogators traded glances in the shadows between the candles, their quills scratching on parchment with an eerie satisfaction. And she felt her pulse rising, a trembling heat spreading beneath her skin. When they mentioned Smeaton's so-called confession, Anne nearly rose from her seat in disbelief, insisting he must have been forced, insisting he would never speak such lies willingly. But her protest only deepened the stillness in the room, because the men questioning her did not care whether the musician had spoken through truth or through torture. His words existed, and that was enough. Then they spoke George's name. Anne felt the world fracture. For a moment, she forgot to breathe. The room tilted. The flicker of the candles blurred. Her fingers dug into the wooden edge of her chair as if trying to keep herself anchored to the earth. They did not speak the accusation immediately. As though savoring the fear that hollowed her chest, they circled it. Circled her. Circled the silence. Until the implication became a weight so unbearable, it felt like a hand pressed against her throat. When they finally spoke the charge, the words seemed to echo unnaturally, as if the walls themselves recoiled. Incest. Anne's head snapped up, her eyes wide, her heart hammering with a force that stole her voice. She shook her head, unable to form the denial fast enough, unable to grasp how imagination could be twisted into something so monstrous. She whispered no, then louder no, then again no, until the word felt like it was tearing her from the inside. But the interrogators remained unmoved, their faces composed, as though they had simply placed another entry onto a ledger. They began asking about private conversations with her brother. Had she confided in him about Henry's moods, Henry's failures, Henry's doubts? Had she ever touched George affectionately the way siblings do, but perceived through the eyes of enemies as something else? Had she ever shared a room with him, even for a moment? Had she ever spoken of Elizabeth's legitimacy in his presence? Had she ever joked about the king? Anne tried to answer, but her voice cracked, the words splintering beneath the weight of disbelief. How could she explain that George was the one person in the world who had never betrayed her? How could she express the horror of hearing their closeness, the bond that had been her strength, reshaped into something vile enough to justify erasing them both? When the interrogation finally ended, they left behind not clarity, but a suffocating emptiness, as though they had removed all the air from the chamber and left her body behind to collapse slowly. She sat unmoving long after they departed, her hands trembling in her lap, her breath coming in thin, ragged gasps. One of her ladies knelt beside her, clutching her hand with desperate tenderness. But Anne Boleyn felt it. Her mind was spiraling through memories George as a child, chasing her through the gardens at Hever. George laughing beside her in the French court. George whispering encouragement when she first caught Henry's eye. George standing behind her during her coronation, with a pride so fierce it ignited her courage. And now he was in another chamber somewhere in this fortress, facing the same horror, hearing his name tied to sins neither of them had ever dreamed of. The thought broke something inside her, something fragile and essential, something she had clung to since childhood. She lowered her face into her hands and let her silent weeping shake her shoulders. When the tower bell tolled noon, the sound rolled through the walls like a slow verdict. And for the first time, Anne realized that the accusations had begun to form a cage around her that no truth could break. The charges were fitting together piece by piece, grotesque pieces of a puzzle she had never touched, but one that Cromwell was assembling with merciless precision. The case no longer required evidence. It required rhythm, momentum, the simple logic of cruelty disguised as justice. She felt herself becoming smaller inside her own skin, shrinking beneath a world determined to remake her into something she was not. Later that day, as shadows lengthened across the floor, the lieutenant returned to inform her that formal charges would soon be read, and a chill ran through her lungs, so cold it stole her breath. She had known this was coming, but hearing the words aloud felt like stepping off a cliff she had only seen from a distance. The trial was being prepared. The story had been written. She was merely the figure placed inside it. That night, long after her ladies had fallen asleep on the stone floor beside her bed, Anne lay awake, staring at the faint moonlight slicing across the ceiling. The tower breathed around her in its ancient rhythm, the slow murmuring of guards, the occasional clang of metal against stone, the restless whisper of wind through the arrow slits. And for the first time she allowed herself to imagine what it meant to stand before the men who would judge her. Men who had already decided the outcome. Men who would listen to accusations crafted to shock them into silence. Men who would see her not as a queen but as a storm they had been commanded to extinguish. She closed her eyes and whispered a prayer for strength. Not because she believed it would save her, but because she needed something, anything to hold on to as the darkness pressed closer. In that quiet, she understood the terrible truth, gathering at her feet like rising water. The trial was not coming. The trial was already here. The morning of her formal accusation arrived without ceremony, without warning, slipping into her chamber, the way cold seeps into marrow quietly, relentlessly, until she found herself shivering before she had even risen from bed. Anne sat very still, staring at the pale light creeping along the stones. A light that once symbolized renewal, but today felt like the opening of a door she could not refuse. Her ladies moved around her with shaking hands, brushing her hair, straightening her gown, fastening her sleeves. Each action performed with a gentleness that revealed more fear than comfort. They did not speak of the trial. They did not need to. The tower's silence had spent days whispering its presence, and now it hovered in the room like a looming shadow, preparing to swallow her whole. When the lieutenant entered with a parchment in hand, the air thickened. He bowed deeply, a gesture soaked in tragedy rather than respect. and began reading the charges with solemn precision, each word landing like a blow against her ribs. She listened as though hearing a stranger's crimes, as though the accusations belonged to some ghostly reflection, not to the woman whose hands rested quietly in her lap. The list grew long, grotesque in its creativity: adultery with Norris, Weston, Breton, and Smeaton, treasonous plots to harm the king, loose and inappropriate behaviour unbefitting a queen. And then the final charge, the one spoken in a voice that trembled ever so slightly, as if even the lieutenant feared the poison of uttering it aloud. Incest with her brother George. Enifiltime fracture. She did not cry out. She did not collapse. She simply lowered her gaze, her eyelashes trembling, as though trying to shield herself from the filth now being draped over her name. The lieutenant continued reading, though his own voice faltered, because even he understood the absurdity of accusing a Queen of England of crimes so deformed that no defence could ever fully cleanse them. When he finished, silence settled like ash. Anna lifted her head slowly, meeting his eyes with a sorrow so profound it cracked the resolve of the hardened man standing before her. "Is there more?" she whispered. Though she already knew the answer, there was always more. The room held its breath as the lieutenant stepped aside, revealing the escorts who had been sent to bring her to the Guildhall where the council waited. She rose with the dignity of a woman who understood she had already been condemned, and now must simply walk toward the inevitable. Her steps echoed softly against the stones, each one carrying her deeper into a nightmare she could neither flee nor awaken from. The path to the trial felt strangely dreamlike, as if she were watching herself from somewhere just outside her own body. The tower's corridors twisted around her, the walls narrowing, the air heavy with the scent of damp stone and burning oil from the torches. She could hear muffled voices ahead, voices of men gathering, voices that once bowed to her authority and now sharpened themselves against her like blades drawn before a hunt. When she stepped outside into the open air, the sunlight had taken on a harsh, metallic quality, casting everything in sharp relief, as though the morning itself wished to expose her vulnerability. The barge ride across the water was mercifully brief, but the whispers rising from the banks were not. People had gathered: servants, traders, curious citizens' faces turned toward her with a mixture of fascination and fear, as though witnessing the fall of a celestial body now plummeting toward the earth. Some crossed themselves, others whispered behind gloved hands. A few simply stared, frozen by the knowledge that they were seeing the undoing of a queen. Anne met none of their eyes. She stared ahead, her heart thrumming with the knowledge that she had become a spectacle. Her tragedy transformed into a public performance. The hall where her trial would take place loomed before her, cavernous and cold. As she was led inside, she saw the faces of the men who had been chosen to judge her 26 peers of the realm, many of whom owed their fortunes to her downfall, their loyalties already purchased, their verdict arranged long before she touched the threshold. At their head sat her own uncle, the Duke of Norfolk, his expression carved from stone, his eyes avoiding hers, as though afraid of catching guilt like a contagion. The murmurs died when Anne entered. She walked forward, each step measured, each breath carefully held, and when she reached the center of the chamber, she turned to face the men who would decide her fate without ever truly listening to her voice. The charges were read again, louder this time, amplified by the cold acoustics of the hall, so that each word echoed back to her in distorted fragments. When they accused her of seducing Norris, she felt the weight of pity settle over her shoulders. When they accused her of enchanting Smeaton, she felt the sting of injustice burn behind her ribs. When they accused her of conspiring with Weston, she felt her breath hitch. And when they accused her of lying with her brother, The chamber seemed to tilt, the faces blurring into indistinct shapes she could no longer bear to focus on. Anne answered each charge with quiet clarity, her voice soft but unwavering. The voice of a woman who knew she had nothing left to lose except the truth she carried within her. She spoke with dignity, with sorrow, with the kind of strength that comes only from a soul cornered by betrayal. She denied every accusation, not with fury, but with a calm sorrow that softened even the sternest faces in the hall. For a fleeting moment, a flicker of doubt passed over one of the judges, but it died instantly under the crushing weight of power already in motion. The prosecution pressed harder, their words sharpened by Cromwell's careful craftsmanship, each detail meticulously constructed to leave no room for innocence. They twisted jokes into confessions, glances into seductions, friendships into dangerous alliances. Every gesture she had ever made was reinterpreted, every kindness repurposed, every moment of humanity weaponized. Anne stood there, absorbing each blow, feeling her identity stripped away with every accusation, until the woman she once was seemed like a distant memory fading behind a thick pane of glass. Then came the testimonies, statements extracted under fear, whispers distilled into supposed truths. Mark Smeaton's confession was read aloud, his words trembling with coercion. Anne closed her eyes, tears slipping silently down her cheeks, not because she believed his betrayal, but because she understood the pain he must have endured to form words that were not his own. Witness after witness stepped forward, none offering true evidence, all offering fragments. Cromwell had turned into a verdict he had already written. When they finally withdrew to deliberate, the hall exhaled a long, heavy breath, and Anne stood alone in the middle of the silent expanse, feeling the enormity of the moment settle into her bones. The verdict came faster than time should have allowed. Guilty. The word landed with the weight of an axe. Final, irreversible, echoing through the chamber like a bell tolling for the dead. Anne lowered her head, a gentle bow of acceptance, not of guilt, but of fate. She felt her heart swell with a strange mixture of sorrow and pride. Sorrow for the injustice carved into her name. Pride for the strength that had kept her upright, even as the world tore itself apart around her. As she was led away, the chamber remained silent, as though even those who condemned her felt the cold sting of what they had done. She walked out of the hall with her spine straight, her steps steady, the quiet dignity of a woman who understood the final truth. The trial had not stolen her soul. It had only revealed the world's. The days that followed her conviction unfolded with an eerie quietness, as though the tower itself had slipped into a hush reserved only for the dying. A hush that stretched and thickened until Anne felt she was moving through a world wrapped in muffled cloth. She no longer woke with the jolting rush of panic she once felt. Instead, she opened her eyes to the cold grey light with a strange sense of stillness, a numbness that dulled the edges of fear. She sat on her narrow bed, hands folded in her lap, listening to the distant sounds of guards changing shifts, the occasional clang of metal, the murmured prayers from the chapel, and she waited. Not because she expected mercy, but because she understood that waiting was now the last task left to her. Her ladies tried to hide their grief, but in the dim hours, when the candles burned low, their composure cracked. One wept softly into a sleeve. Another kept dropping her rosary beads, as though her hands could no longer remember how to hold anything steady. And a third stared at Anne with a hollow expression that suggested she had never truly believed the world capable of such brutality. Anne offered them gentleness, speaking in a voice that surprised even her with its calmness. She comforted them the way a mother comforts children, frightened of shadows, whispering reassurances, she knew did not belong to her fate, but belonged to theirs. Sometimes the roles reversed, and they knelt beside her, gripping her hands, their tears falling onto her gown like cold rain. But Anne felt a growing distance, a quiet acceptance forming inside her like a shell. Even the lieutenant's demeanour shifted in those days. He visited her chambers not with the stiff courtesy of duty, but with the bowed posture of a man burdened by guilt. He could not speak aloud. Once, when he delivered the news that her execution had been delayed by a day to allow the French swordsman time to arrive, she watched his face pale with the shame of delivering death wrapped in politeness. Anne simply nodded, thanked him softly, and when he left, she closed her eyes and exhaled a long, steady breath, not of relief, but of surrender to the rhythm of days that no longer belonged to her. In the quiet hours, she reflected on the people who had shaped her world, on Henry, whose love had once felt like the brightest fire God had ever allowed to touch the earth, on her father, whose ambition had carved paths she had been forced to walk, on her sister Mary, whose disappearance into obscurity now seemed like wisdom, and on her brother George, whose laughter she still heard in the spaces of silence. She wondered whether he was afraid during his final moments, whether he had spoken of her, whether he had clung to hope until the last heartbeat, or whether he had understood, as she now did. That hope is sometimes a chain disguised as salvation. She folded memories of George into her heart like fragile letters, recalling how he teased her during their childhood at Hever, how he defended her when caught whispered too loudly, how his confidence in her had once gleamed like a shield. The thought that they were to be erased together, their names dragged through mud and filth, their reputations twisted into grotesque warnings for others, brought a sharp ache to her ribs. But even that ache softened as time passed, replaced by a deep, melancholy tenderness. She whispered prayers for him, not for his soul, which she believed had risen beyond pain, but for the memory of him, hoping the world would one day peel away the lies and see the quiet beauty of a man who had loved fiercely and died unjustly. As the days slipped by, Anne found her thoughts turning more often toward Elizabeth. Her daughter's name became a mantra, a secret rhythm she repeated silently to keep her breath steady. She imagined Elizabeth running through sunlit corridors, her small hands brushing the tapestries, her bright, curious eyes scanning the world with a brilliance inherited from both parents. Anne prayed that someone would protect her, that the shadow cast over her birth would not smother her future, that the child who carried her heartbeat inside her would be allowed to grow into a woman untouched by the venom that had destroyed her mother. She knew she would not be the one to raise Elizabeth, but she hoped fiercely, desperately, that the girl would one day understand that her mother's fall had nothing to do with sin and everything to do with the brutal machinery of power. There were hours when the tower felt almost peaceful, when the sunlight fell softly across the floor, and Anne could pretend, just for a heartbeat, that she was simply resting in a quiet room far from court. But those illusions dissolved quickly whenever she heard the procession of guards, the rustle of documents, the distant sound of someone crying out in another chamber. She began noticing details she had missed in the first days, the faint grooves worn into the stone by the boots of prisoners before her, the amber tint of the candles that flickered strangely when the wind crept through the narrow windows, the ancient wooden beams that creaked at night as though murmuring the final confessions of those long forgotten. On one of the final evenings, she received a visit from Archbishop Cranmer. His face was ashen, his voice trembling with a mixture of reverence and sorrow. He brought word that her marriage to Henry had been annulled, a logical absurdity delivered with solemnity, a cruel paradox in which she was declared guilty of betraying a marriage that officially no longer existed. Anne listened without interruption, feeling the absurdity wash over her like cold water. And when he finished, she thanked him politely, Even though the words of annulment had wounded her more deeply than any accusation, the marriage that had once been her triumph had now been erased like chalk, washed away by rain. She realized then that part of her grief was not for the life she would lose, but for the life she had lived with such intensity. A life now repackaged as if it had never existed. That night she lay awake longer than usual, watching the moon drift across the narrow window like a silent witness. She did not cry. The well of tears inside her felt emptied, drained by days of interrogation, trial, and waiting. Instead, she allowed her thoughts to flow quietly, like water through her fingers. She remembered the warmth of Henry's hand the first time he touched her, the tremble in his voice when he confessed he could not live without her, the fierce certainty she felt when she finally agreed to marry him. She remembered the joy of her coronation, the roar of the crowd, the weight of the crown pressing into her hair. She remembered the first kick of Elizabeth inside her womb, the way she whispered promises to the unborn child, promises she now knew she would not be able to keep. As dawn approached on the day before her execution, the tower seemed to exhale a long, heavy breath, as if mourning the tragedy unfolding within its walls. Anne dressed slowly, choosing a gown of deep grey that softened the lines of her body, and tied her hair back so that the wind would not catch it. She felt strangely calm, the calm of someone who has already walked through the worst flames and now stands at the edge of ashes. She whispered another prayer for Elizabeth, then one for George, then one for her own soul, asking not for forgiveness, but for remembrance. When the lieutenant entered her chamber once more, his eyes glistened with unspoken sorrow. But Anne only smiled faintly, a fragile curve of the lips that carried more courage than any words. She was ready. Not to die, because no one is ever ready to die, but ready to stop being afraid, ready to step into the final chapter that had been written for her the moment she dared to reach for a crown. And as the tower bell began to toll the slow, mournful rhythm of morning, Anne stepped forward, her spine straight, her breath steady, embracing the quiet dignity that remained to her, the dignity no verdict could steal. She had become, in her final days, something the world had never allowed her to be unbroken. The morning of her death arrived with a stillness so profound that even the tower ravens refused to stir, as though the world itself sensed that a life was about to slip from its grasp. Anne rose before her ladies stirred, her body surprisingly light, as though the long nights of fear had burned themselves into smoke that now drifted away with each breath she took. She dressed slowly, her fingers steady as they fastened the bodice of her gown, selecting a deep damask fabric the color of fading twilight, a color that felt neither defiant nor resigned but simply honest, the color of endings that still hold a trace of beauty. Her hair she pinned beneath a simple headdress, smoothing every strand with a tenderness she wished she could have given herself in the days when the world still pretended to love her. Her ladies woke to the sight of her standing near the window, the early light brushing her cheek with a gentleness that felt almost like an apology from the heavens. They rushed to her, some crying before they could utter a word, others simply holding her hands with shaking fingers. Anne smiled at them softly, the kind of smile she once used to calm Elizabeth during restless nights. A smile that could hush storms, if storms ever learned to listen. She whispered to them not to cry, her voice steady, almost warm. "This is God's will," she murmured, though she did not know whether she believed it. Perhaps she said it for them, or perhaps she said it for herself. A fragile anchor of meaning in a sea of senseless cruelty. When the lieutenant arrived, he paused in the doorway as if uncertain whether he had the right to interrupt such an intimate moment. His face carried the exhaustion of a man who had watched too many tragedies pass through his hands. He bowed deeply. "My lady," he said softly, "the time has come. Anne nodded, her spine straightening with a quiet dignity, and for a moment the room felt suspended in a breath, neither beginning nor ending. She turned to her ladies, embracing each of them in turn, whispering reassurances that broke their composure completely. One fell to her knees, gripping the hem of Anne's gown, begging through tears for the world to right itself. But Anne gently lifted her, holding her face between her palms as though cradling something precious. The walk from her chamber to the courtyard was short, but each step felt elongated, stretched into a path woven from memories, regrets, hopes, and the strange peace that comes when fear is finally exhausted. The tower walls rose high on both sides, ancient and unfeeling, but the morning light washed them in gold, turning the oppressive stone into something almost sacred. Anne lifted her chin, breathing in the crisp air, letting it settle into her lungs like a final gift. Ahead, she saw the small platform built upon Tower Green, the wooden scaffold stark against the soft grass, flanked by solemn figures whose faces held a mixture of curiosity, pity, and something quieter shame. The French swordsman waited beside the block, his expression unreadable, his posture respectful, the blade hidden from view so as not to haunt her final walk. This, she had been told, was a kindness ordered by the king, a small mercy for the queen he had destroyed. Anne felt no bitterness. She had wept all her tears in the nights before. Now she carried only an immense stillness, a sense that her life had condensed into something small and bright, like a flame cupped gently in two hands. She ascended the steps alone, her gown whispering against the wood, and turned to face the small crowd assembled to witness her end. The sunlight haloed the edges of her figure, turning her into something almost ethereal, a woman half in the world and half already beyond it. She scanned the faces, guards, courtiers, servants she once greeted by name, and she felt no anger toward them, only sorrow, only release. One fell to her knees, gripping the hem of Anne's gown, begging through tears for the world to right itself. But Anne gently lifted her, holding her face between her palms as though cradling something precious. The walk from her chamber to the courtyard was short, but each step felt elongated, stretched into a path woven from memories, regrets, hopes, and the strange peace that comes when fear is finally exhausted. Instead, she offered forgiveness freely, gracefully, impossibly, because she understood that her final task was not to rewrite truth, but to ease the weight her death might leave on the souls of those forced to bear witness. She praised the king, calling him a gentle and sovereign lord, though the crowd could see the heartbreak flicker behind her eyes. She asked them to pray for her, then folded her hands together and whispered a final plea to God, her voice barely audible, carried away on the morning breeze. When she finished, she removed her headdress and handed it to one of her ladies, her dark hair falling softly around her shoulders. For a fleeting moment, she looked impossibly young, as though the crown she once wore had aged her beyond recognition, and now, stripped of it, she had stepped backward into the girl. She was long before Henry changed her fate. The ladies blindfolded her gently. The world dimmed behind a veil of white linen, and she knelt, her posture serene, her hands clasped in prayer, to Jesus Christ. She whispered, her voice trembling just once, "I commend my soul." She repeated the prayer softly, rhythmically, each breath a surrender, each word a thread tying her spirit to the heavens. The swordsman stepped forward silently, his movements fluid, practiced, devoid of cruelty. He called softly for her attention. Anne turned her head slightly, instinctively. And in that breath, between the small shift of her cheek and the soft rustle of his feet, the sword passed through the air, with a whisper so swift that the crowd did not register the moment until it had already ended. Her body remained poised for an instant, as though refusing to fall, and then with a quiet exhale she sank gently onto the straw-covered boards. Silence broke across Tower Green like a wave. It was not the silence of shock or fear, but the solemn hush, reserved for endings too profound for words. Some bowed their heads, some crossed themselves, some simply stared, aware that they had witnessed not just the death of a queen, but the death of a world that had begun and ended with her. Her ladies rushed forward, their sobs breaking through the quiet as they gathered her body in trembling arms. They placed her gently into the crude arrow chest the tower offered. Knock off in prepared. No ceremony granted. They held her hand one final time, brushing strands of hair from her pale face, their tears falling onto her, still features like blessings. The sun rose higher, indifferent yet warm, casting light upon the scaffold where a woman who once commanded nations had been reduced to a silent form wrapped in humble cloth. And as the guards lifted the chest to carry her into the chapel for burial, the breeze stirred the grass, whispering against the stone, as though the tower itself mourned what it had taken. Anne Boleyn left the world, not as the monster her enemies invented, nor as the temptress history tried to paint, but as a woman flawed, brilliant, brave, who had dared to reach for a life larger than the world permitted her to live. Her story, carved now into the marrow of England, would outlive the injustice that ended her, growing in whispers, in legends, in the hearts of those who learned to see past the lies. And somewhere, in another corner of the kingdom, a young girl with bright, watchful eyes would one day grow into the woman who would reclaim everything her mother had lost.